evening, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of Perspectives. Perspective is a new show that we're adding to the Guyanese Critic platform. Perspectives is a new show. Sorry, we're having some sorting out the technical difficulties. Perspectives is a new show that we are adding to the Guyanese Critic platform. The intention is that on this show, every week we have guests in studio talking about issues affecting Guyanese from their perspective. It was our intention to have the perspective of both government and the opposition on topical issues. So let me again apologize for the late start and bring you some news. Mr. Elson Lowe will not be joining us. We confirmed with Mr. Lowe weeks ago. We also reached out to him yesterday to confirm. We confirmed with him again today, and at the 11th hour, he said that he can no longer join us. However, thankfully, we have Mr. Bhagwandin in the studio with us. Mr. Bhagwandin is a financial analyst, so thank you for taking the time and being here with me to discuss the topic that we advertise, which is the Dutch disease. But before we get into that discussion, let me ask you a question. Is the opposition afraid of debates?
Candace, first of all, good evening to you and good evening to our viewers. Thank you for having me as one of the first guests on this show. You're asking me a question that you really should be asking the opposition. However, I'm going to attempt to answer it. I have been following Elson Lowe, of course, because of his portfolio. He is the economic advisor. He holds the portfolio of, which is an important portfolio, a very weighty portfolio, because the opposition leader is a constitutional office holder and has an important role to play in policy making and in governing the country.
Yes.
He holds the portfolio of economic advisor to the opposition leader. And since he has been introduced in the arena and been appearing on press conferences and making public statements and utterances on economic issues, I found that all of his views, all of his economic positions and arguments are divorced from reality. They're abstract, they lack depth, they're not even a surface level analysis. And I think I would have responded to one of his debate on, or his position on the level of debt of the country. I would have done an extensive response to that in the press.
Okay.
So when I look at the promo for the show today on the Guyanese Critic page, and I looked at the comments, one of my fear, Candace, which I told you at the beginning, this show is not an overnight, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning.
Yes.
This show was in the making for 2 or 3 weeks.
Now.
Since 3 weeks or probably a month ago,
Correct.
we're supposed to have this show, but because of the cricket and all of that, we've had several delays. Elson would have cancelled on the first, I believe, when we were supposed to have the first show. That didn't happen. So we managed to reconfirm. And I said to you, I called you and I said, you know what, I think when you told me the topic, I had already sent out a comprehensive piece I did on the mid-year economic report that was published by the Ministry of Finance. And if he took some time today to really, I imagine he probably took the time today to prepare. He went and he looked at those comments. Okay. And the comments alone would have psychologically scared him off. Okay. Right? And for me, that if I was him, I would have gone to research my opponent and see what my opponent has done. And he would have found a wealth of published articles I've written, and that was published in all the media houses, different sections of the media. I recently launched my own website today, a Blogspot, which is a collection of all of my articles. And if he would have definitely stumbled on those and read how comprehensive it was, how deep analytic it was, based on data, based on empirical evidence, not surface level literature, abstract analysis. And then how are you going to come and debate with a guy like that versus, some ridiculous things you've been saying as an economist? So that's my take. I think I can't speak for the entire opposition, but given him specifically in this debate, I would have researched my opponent, and my view is that he's mortally scared.
All right. So just a point of clarification: the first cancellation was not on him. We had some delays that we had to cancel, but nevertheless, he did confirm with us yesterday. We've been doing this thing. Anyway, as they say, the show must go on.
And I want to register my deep disappointment that he's not here. You saw that.
I am extremely disappointed. I am extremely disappointed. I think Mr. Lowe holds an important position in the opposition. Guyana is an oil-producing nation, and he's the economic advisor to the leader of the opposition, and as such, it's important for him to avail himself to add his view to such discussions. And this is a perfect opportunity, because it's not a case where he is saying something and he's in his own space and you're saying and you're responding to him. He had the opportunity to come here and to look at you in the eye and to have a debate, to have an intellectual exchange of ideas. And so I'm disappointed.
And you know what's funny? The opposition altogether have been, and everyone, and more so when convenient, have been making this case about inclusive governance, inclusive policy making and inclusive growth, that terminology of inclusiveness. Now, inclusiveness from the perspective of policy making, right? And you're advising the opposition leader. This is how policy making is done. By debates, by exchanging views, by justifying your position from, of course, an academic basis or empirical basis.
And presenting arguments to substantiate the claims that you're making.
So the claims that they can't go to the public and say that there is no inclusiveness when they are excluding themselves, right? They're excluding themselves from the process. So you can't say that, well, there is no inclusiveness when you're excluding yourself from a debate that forms an integral part in making policy, shaping policy.
And if you have the best interest for all Guyanese at heart, then it's important for you to come and add your voice to the debate and to make suggestions and recommendations on how we can make Guyana better for all Guyanese.
Exactly. And I've been doing this for the past 5 years, not yesterday or last month or last year, but 5 years I've been doing this consistently.
Okay. All right, so let's get back to, despite that, we're still moving ahead because I think this topic of the Dutch disease is important. A lot of Guyanese, I'm sure, are hearing the term but do not necessarily understand what it means. You have the background to give to add clarity to any sort of misconceptions that people have, and also to try to kind of dispel some of the things that are out there that you think are not in keeping with how you view the particular topic. So the first thing I want you to do is to define for our viewers, what is the Dutch disease?
All right, so thank you for that. So I'll put it over in the most simplest fashion without being too technical.
Yes.
Now, the Dutch disease, it's a theory in economics that simply means when a country has an abundance of natural resources and there is a boom in natural resource revenue, and this is where we're poised to be. Oil revenues, we're poised to earn about $1 billion this year, and as more FPSOs come on stream, we're gonna earn probably about $5 billion a year by 2026, 2027. $5 billion is more than 50% of our total GDP. In fact, it's more than 100% of our pre-oil GDP, which was $4 billion. So what happens is that it's a phenomenon where you have a change in relative price, where what that means is all the other sectors in the economy are underperforming, for specifically the manufacturing sector, and you have the boom in the natural resource, you have what is called an appreciation of the domestic currency. Now, what that does, why it is dangerous for the economy, when you have an appreciation of the dollar, it means the local currency becomes stronger against the US dollar.
Okay.
Now, at the sound of it, it sounds like something good, because this is the view by the average person. When I speak with the average person on the street, the idea is why we don't have a stronger dollar. But if you allow that to happen sharply and rapidly, it means our export market, all the companies that are involved in exporting Sterling, exporting ice cream, Bangladesh is a big exporter of their products. The entire manufacturing sector that has an export market, coal and all the other export commodities will become more expensive. And as it become more expensive, what's going to happen? You become less competitive, because we are not the only producers of these items. You have other producers who are going to naturally become more competitive in international markets. So you have a decline in your non-oil exports. Right? So when that happens, your imports become cheaper. So on one hand, you have the people who are involved in the export business. They're going to go out of business. And if they account for the employment of, let's say, 100,000 of our labor force, or 20% or 25%, if 25% of the manufacturing sector goes out of business, you're putting 100,000 people, using rough numbers, on the bread line. Those companies going bankrupt, perhaps out of business, or whatever the case is. On the other hand, you have importers now. They're going to become richer because imports gonna become cheaper. Yes. So it's like it's a delicate you're destroying one side of the economy at the expense of this, and that happens. That situation usually happens because a government's responsibility is to manage those dynamics, to prevent that from happening. So that happens, like in the case where this situation originated, which is a case in the Netherlands way back, when government does nothing to intervene, to manage, when government does nothing by way of intervention in terms of policies to address the situation, right? So for example, and I give an example of what's happening here right now. Naturally, the labor force is going to go to a sector, and we had this before oil, when we had the gold rush. I was in 2013. I was in a place called Port Kaituma, predominantly gold mining, and so years ago, Port Kaituma Region 1 was predominantly agriculture. You had the best agriculture produce coming out of Port Kaituma. And when they had the gold rush, everybody got into gold. Everybody from across the country, Berbice, Essequibo, Demerara, went there. And so everybody got out of agriculture because gold got money. So nobody into agriculture anymore. Everybody gone to gold. And then in 2013, you had the gold price, just after 2013, 2014, the gold price plummeted, and that entire village, that entire region went into depression. Business went down. Everybody, it was literally dead. It's now probably recovering right after all these years. So that's what happened. That is what happened when you don't have on a macro scale the intervention of the policy to deal with it.
Okay, great. I know Mr. Lowe isn't here, and because I wanted him to directly respond to some of the things I've seen being attributed to him in the local press. So there is a Kaitra News article published September 2022 where Mr. Lowe is quoted as saying that Guyana is showing early signs of the Dutch disease.
Good.
Comment on that. Is Guyana showing early signs of the Dutch disease?
So, yes, Mr. Lowe said that, and he based it on the fact that the mid-year report, a few subsectors declined. And that was the main basis or premise of his conclusion that there are signs of the Dutch disease. Now, so let me expound on that. And the sectors where the sugar and rice had a decline, manufacturing had a decline. But you have to understand what is the underlying factor, what is the underlying reason. Sugar and rice, they had inclement weather. We can't control inclement weather. right? There was the flood.
Sorry about that.
Rice don't grow overnight. You have 2 crops a year, right? So naturally you're going to have a reduction in output. Manufacturing sector declined because you have with the global, we're in inflationary times with global disruption of the supply chain and everything
crisis,
else.
yes.
So the input costs for manufacturing went up. So if your cost goes up, what happens to demand? Demand falls. But what he did not state is that you had other sectors that show growth. Overall, you had growth in the agriculture sector.
These are sectors in the non-oil economy?
Yes, the forestry sector, the non-oil economy recorded positive growth overall of 8%. And in 2020, you had the non-oil economy contracted by 7%. Now, I want to explain something important, Candace. The thing about how economic policies work, you have to see you can't take a half-year report to see the beauty of it or the full picture. You need to look at 5-10 years and look at the policy and the effects of those policies. The effect of it don't happen overnight. It's like looking at a woman, right? You're looking at a woman, you see her from far, you probably just see her from at the back. You didn't see her in entirety to see her true beauty, right? Until when you're so it's the same. You can't look at the half-year report to see the true beauty and what's happening. So let's go back a bit. Lowe is not correct to say that there are signs of the Dutch disease. However, what would have been correct to say, had we continued along the path by implementing the type of economic policies that when they were in government, previous administration, which he is a part of that organization, the type of policy that they were pursuing, if that had continued, we would have been having signs of Dutch disease by now. Let me substantiate that. I don't want to give surface level comments. Let me substantiate that with facts.
Before you go there, I want you to answer a question for me. You said that Ghana recorded positive growth in the non-oil economy.
Right.
And if that is the case, isn't it therefore, and you have to tell me, isn't it therefore a contradiction if there's positive growth in a non-oil economy when the Dutch disease is present? Is it correct to say that there's no positive growth in the non-oil economy?
No.
Okay.
And then so there's two things you have to look at. Not just the growth, whether it contract or increase. You got to look at whether there is a change in relative price, whether there is a sharp appreciation, and there was not a sharp appreciation.
Okay.
You had less than the exchange rate appreciated by less than 1%. Now, if we go back to 2009 to 2020. Now let's break that up in half, because during this period they had two different governments that has fundamentally two different type of economic philosophy and political ideology and economic ideology altogether. When you look at the exchange rate, movement of exchange rate from 2009 to 2014, that's 5 years, right? Okay. The exchange rate depreciated by 2.25%, right? In 5 years, you had a depreciation of 2.25%, right? When you look at before oil, under their economic stewardship now, from 2015 to 2020, the exchange rate depreciated by 3.84%. That's almost 4%, right? That's if that had continued, that is a sign of the Dutch disease. So what this government was burdened with, they had to go into office and to reverse those policies to go back to start to rebuild. And I can explain further why they had that sharp depreciation under their period versus a lesser rate of depreciation under this government in 2009 to 2004. I can explain that.
All right, but before you explain, I would love you to explain that, talking about the depreciation under APNU stewardship. I don't want you to only talk about the numbers. What was the level of impact that had on ordinary Guyanese?
to look at the level of impact, you got to understand GDP,
Okay.
and you got to understand how GDP growth is measured. When you look at the service sector,
Okay.
when you look at entertainment, when you look at all the other sectors. So GDP, let me explain GDP and how you could extrapolate the impact on ordinary Guyanese.
And for viewers listening who don't know what that is, explain.
So GDP is an economic metric that measures the rate of growth of the economy. I mean, it's argued that GDP doesn't tell you about Human Development Index and all of that, right? Which is a plausible case to argue, right? But let's dissect what is GDP. GDP measures increased spending in investment, increased spending in government spending, spending in household expenditure, spending your trade balance, which is the net balance between exports and imports, right? So it's the expenditure in the economy in all these areas, including households. If you want to know the impact on household, you look at your consumption expenditure, how households spending on consumption goods. When you look at the indicators in the banking sector, mortgage, personal loans went up, mortgage went up, all the individual indicators in personal lending, mortgage lending. When people borrow to build a house for a home, that is improvement in their livelihood. Because when you now have an asset in your name, you can leverage the value of that asset to generate more wealth for your family. Let me go back a little bit back to put some context. People talk about this poverty and this inequality thing, right? Here is what people don't know. This is an important perspective for viewers.
Yes, it is.
We came from a bankrupt country. There was a time when this country was virtually bankrupt. We had no money, right? When a country is bankrupt, and in our case, it means everybody is in poverty. It means 100% of the population is in poverty. Our private sector is only just over 2 decades old. The richest Guyanese conglomerate in this country came from poverty, right? There was a time when 80% of this economy, more than 80%, was controlled by the state, so nobody then had wealth. So whatever wealth that Guyanese have accumulated in businessmen and individual and the middle class, we've accumulated over the last 30 years, right? So from 100% poverty, the United Nations report...
there'll be those on the opposition.
The United Nations report, look, let it dispute it with facts, not dispute it on emotions and your feeling and your agenda and propaganda. Dispute it with facts. I'm telling you here facts which could be verified. You go and look, these are publicly credible data. 1992, 1985, we were a bankrupt state. Everybody in poverty. That's why people fled this country. There is no opportunity. We were in a crisis almost like in Venezuela right now. So from then to now, we have moved from a from a per capita income of $200, right, 2 decades ago, to $5,000, and today to $5,000 before $5,000 US before we started to produce oil in 2019 to $9,000 today. You know what is our poverty level today? From 100% poverty to 35% of, according to a United Nations report study, 35% of the population living under the poverty line. So it means we have lifted 65% of the population out of poverty in 2 decades.
Well, how does that... Okay, fine. Granted, taken, that's your position. But how does what you're saying there actually match up with what I hear coming out from the opposition side, rather that Guyanese are experiencing poverty like never before?
So where is the data? So let me explain something to you, right? Mm-hmm. You know what harbors poverty, right? And how we get out of poverty? Not by giving people. They want to give every household $1 million, which we don't have that amount of money. That's what they've been advocating. But that's not how you lift people out of poverty. Education.
True.
Right? Less than 5% of the labor force possess a tertiary education. Less than 5%. There's a Bureau of Stats report, labor force survey study,
labor force
right?
survey.
So less than 5%. So it means 95% of the labor force has less than a tertiary level education. So this is why, what are the policies government doing to deal with that? That is how you're going to deal with poverty. Education, 20,000 scholarship program. There is a commitment for free education at the tertiary level by 2025, making access and affordability of education, so to educate the population. But in the meanwhile, there is a huge gap that we have to fill. So we have to look at immigration and bring in people, right? So that's on the education side. And then you have to create opportunity. You have to lift people out of poverty. You have to equip them with the tools, education, resources, entrepreneurship training, making grants available to start a business, teaching them how to run a business, teaching them how to build a business plan, how to access financing. You have institutions that are doing this, including government agencies, the Small Business Bureau, and several programs. So, and then you have to create the environment for there to be opportunities to create businesses which would lift people out of poverty.
And help them to remain there.
Correct.
Once they've been lifted out of poverty.
Correct. Yeah. So you have to invest in the infrastructure. You have to build the infrastructure to support that level of growth. The bridge that we're building across the Demerara River, how will that translate to lifting people out of poverty? Now, first of all, that bridge was supposed to have been built since back in 2011, when this opposition had the majority. We had a minority government, and they control the National Assembly, and they stymied the development of this country. Had that not happened, we would have already had the bridge. So what does that bridge could translate to? You commuting to work, 3 hours in traffic in the morning, 3 hours in traffic in the afternoon, that's 6 hours a day. Now, what is, let's say your hourly rate is $100. That is $600 a day you're losing. Multiply $600 a day by 265 days or 300 days a year. Multiply that by 10 years or 11 years. That is what you have lost in productivity. That is what this country has lost per person. And on the West End, you have more than half of the population. So multiply that by 100,000 people. The loss of productivity of this country in terms of from an individual perspective and in terms of businesses. Yes. That is what it means. That is what we have been deprived of. A simple bridge. I could explain every single project, how the multiply effect would translate to lifting every person out of poverty. Every single project, but we don't have enough time. I just use one example with the bridge. We could talk about the port. We could talk about the deepwater port, how that would accommodate if per capita income is going to increase, projected to increase from $9,000 today to $30,000 in 10 years. It means people have earning more income, they have more disposable income, they're going to spend more, they're going to consume more, they're going to invest more. So trade is going to increase. We don't have the infrastructure to support that level of increase. More than 60% trade is projected to increase. More than 100% perhaps, based on the pace at which development is happening. Imagine when you have cheaper energy and the manufacturing sector becomes more competitive. In Trinidad and Tobago, you have cheap energy driven by natural gas. The cost of energy is 5 cents a kilowatt. We're paying 30 cents a kilowatt. The manufacturing sector accounts for about 30% of GDP in Trinidad and Tobago. Manufacturing sector here accounts for 5% of GDP in Guyana. So cheap energy means the manufacturing sector could have a larger contribution to GDP. That's how you mitigate the Dutch disease syndrome. And this is what we're doing and where we're heading.
All right. I like that you said that. I read an article in from DPI, where you were quoted as stating that a thorough analysis was not done before the opposition, before persons like Mr. Lowe came up with the contention that the Dutch disease is present in Guyana. Do you still stand by that view?
The Dutch, at this present moment, no. The Dutch disease is not present because our exchange rate is stable. The government is implementing proactive policies and they're making the investment in the infrastructure at a rapid pace, as fast as they could, so that we don't get to that level. So it's being managed well from getting there. And again, I reiterate, if we had continued along the path that we were on, right, evidently and arguably, and if you allow me, I could go into the numbers, right? I would love to go into the numbers.
Before
right?
we go into the number.
Right?
So you're saying they didn't do a thorough analysis of the economy?
They don't even understand the economy. How are they going to analyze it?
All right. Question. So you have been stating that government has implemented several measures to mitigate the presence or the effects of to prevent the Dutch disease from becoming a reality in Ghana, because your contention is that it's not present here. Is it inevitable though?
Again, let me qualify my argument. No, it's not present. Is it inevitable? It's not inevitable. Is it a possibility? Is it a cause for concern? Yes, it is a cause for concern. I'm not saying that it can't happen. It is a cause of concern. It could happen. We have to take the actions now, the policies that we implement now. Whether the degree to which that possibility could occur, whether it's inevitable, the degree to which it becomes inevitable depends on the type of policies we implement now and the kind of investments we do now. If we have, let's say, for example, the opposition come and block the Demerara Bridge, block the hydro, block the natural gas project, which they did in the case of the Amila Falls project back in 2011, it will be inevitable if these projects are being blocked from being pursued. As long as we have these projects going through at a rapid pace and we implement them and we start to derive the benefits, it is not inevitable, but it is a concern which has to be managed, and that is the job of the government, which they're doing quite good so far.
Okay. Do you think, is there anything else that can be done to prevent it from becoming a reality?
Yeah, so
not inevitable, possibility,
So I'm glad you raised that question. So at some point, because of the windfall of revenue, we are ramping up production, right? We're ramping up production from 120,000 to now 340,000, and then over 800,000. At some point in the medium term, what we would have to do, we have to look at a revaluation of the currency. And the Bank of Guyana governor has already hinted at, which is any person who understands economics, any real economist, any finance person would know that apart from investing the economic diversification program that we're doing, building out the economy, investing in agriculture, driving regional energy security, driving food security, regional food security. Regional food security, we're talking about a $5 billion US market. Regional energy security means we're talking, I had a presentation yesterday at the summit, we're talking about right now an 800 million US market. If the region is serious about implementing a regional energy security agenda and transition to natural gas as a transition fuel and make the investment in the infrastructure to support that, then we're talking about a $9 billion market in terms of energy security, which we could, between Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, and Trinidad and so forth, could supply that market, right, in the future. So once we're doing all of this, in addition to that, to your question, in addition to all of that, you will have to look at revaluation of the currency to prevent that sharp appreciation, rather than allowing the currency to appreciate based on demand and supply dynamics, which is going to have that effect that I explained earlier. You go to revaluation, but you have to meet certain prerequisite conditions first, which before I just explained. Yeah.
All right, so I want us to touch on the golden rule of growth. But before we get there, would you agree that they are local drivers of inflation and global drivers of inflation?
Certainly.
So in that context, in terms of the global drivers of inflation, the government has no control over that. The government cannot control, or the government couldn't control the effects of the supply chain crisis. Is the government, however, doing enough to mitigate the effects of inflation in Guyana?
So you're asking me two questions. let me deal with the domestic one first, right? Locally, based on what the government could control, the government can't control the external shocks, what's happening, because we're not producing everything that we consume as yet, right? We import our import trade balance is usually a deficit. So we import most of the goods we consume. So that's why we import the inflation from the rest of the world, right?
Okay.
You go to the supermarket, the cornflakes that we buy in the supermarket, we didn't make it here. It makes somewhere else in the world. So whatever happens to the cost of input goods for the cornflakes in the supermarket and the cost to bring it here to put it on that shelf, we're paying all that cost. That is imported inflation.
What about the things that we're producing here locally?
Well, the things we're producing here, because we had the 2 years shutdown, and then we reopened the economy. Naturally, you have demand went up, and then you have a booming oil and gas sector. So agriculture, you had shortage of agriculture produce, and then that was compounded by floods and other events. So naturally, demand and supply. If you have a shortage of supply, price will go up. So we need to get more we need to increase production. So is the government doing enough? So I've heard again, and I'm going to do it in the context of what the opposition has said, our dear friend Elson Lowe. So he has made several recommendations that we must use the oil money to subsidize fuel. We must use oil money to subsidize everything and do everything from the moon to the sun to everything, right? Everything in the universe. But if he had taken the time to do a simple quantitative analysis of the impact of the measures that the government has implemented, he would find that from 2020, the first budget that the government implemented, right, they reverse a series of taxes that burdensome taxes that the opposition, when they were in the government, put on over the 5 years. VAT and a whole bunch of fees and everything. That additional taxes was amounted to $60 billion in additional revenue a year. So by reversing all those taxes, automatically you put back $60 billion in the economy, in the pockets of consumers, and in freeing up cash flow for companies, right? So that was one measure that you have to take into account. That's $60 billion. Then you had the fuel price start to skyrocket.
Yes.
So during their tenure, when you had a similar, the purpose of that excise tax of about 30% or 50% on fuel was really a built-in stabilizer to stabilize fuel prices. Now, what does that mean? It means that fuel as a commodity the price fluctuate based on demand and supply globally. So you want to stabilize the price, you have a built-in stabilizer vis-a-vis the tax. So what that allows you to do as a policymaker, a government running the country, when you have an increase in the price, you lower the tax to stabilize the price to the consumer. This government did that when they were in previous government, because that's how it intended to work, right? They never did that. When prices went up, they never reduced that excise tax. Not even a cent from it, right? Not even 1% percentage point. So this government, when that situation happened, they reduced the tax from 30% or 50 or 30%, I believe, down to 0%. You know how much revenue they've foregone? That excise tax on fuel accounted for $20 billion in annual revenue. They foregone $20 billion. That's a cost. So that's 60 plus $20 billion, right? Then the shipping, which is a major cost that translates right back to the consumer, because you have to ship the goods to get it on the shelf. Transportation, shipping, logistics to get the goods, the final price on the shelf in the supermarket that the consumer pays. Shipping skyrocketed by more than 500%, more than during that pandemic period. And so what the government did was to revert the shipping rate, the freight, the pre-pandemic level. That's a subsidy to subsidize that. That's another cost. Then you take into account the subsidies, the grants and subsidies, and there was a $5 billion and several other measures, cost of living measures, intervention. When you do the quantification of that, cumulatively, 2021, 2022, and 2020, you know how much it amounts to? $226 billion. You know how much that represents in the Natural Resource Fund? From the time we start to earn the first dollar in 2020 to July 2022, 96%. So in other words, the equivalent in terms of the cost of those measures implemented by the government in response to the inflationary period, in imported inflation, the cost of living situation amounted to almost 100% of the money we earn from oil in measures. Now let's talk about the global. We can't do nothing about global, right?
No, we can't do anything about it, global.
But we're doing something regionally
Fine.
to mitigate the effects of of external shocks from the global economy, and that is the importance of the regional energy security agenda. We are driving that at the regional level, and that is the importance of the food security energy agenda at the regional level, which Guyana, is driving.
All right, good, great. So I have a couple more questions for you, but before I ask you those questions, the technical guy just informed me that the viewers want you to go over the definition, to explain exactly what the Dutch disease is, and I will implore you to explain it in a way that a common man can understand.
Okay, let me see how I could do this.
Simplify it for us.
Let me see how I could simplify it. We have a sector that we never had before.
Oil.
Right? And this sector, this one sector, has the potential to bring 2 times, 5 times the GDP for this whole country. In fact, our GDP, we've just now explained what was GDP, right?
Yes.
Our GDP pre-oil was $4 billion. Our GDP currently is $8 billion. We double it with oil production because of the increased spending. GDP is spending in the sector of all these investment in shore base and production and so on. GDP is projected to quadruple by 2030. The amount of revenue, all things being equal at a price of $60 that we're going to get from Liza 1, Liza 2, Payara and Yellowtail over the life of those projects is about 49 billion US. That's about 12 times our current GDP. So we have a sector that has the potential to give us in just over a decade, or just in let's say 2 decades period, 15 times, 12 times the value of this entire country. So
And what the other sectors can give us.
So the effect of that is you could have a change in relative price, means the currency becomes stronger against the US dollar. All the people in the manufacturing sector exporting, they go out of business, because if your export suddenly becomes expensive, nobody's going to buy it. So if nobody can buy it, what happens? You go out of business. You go some other country. So that is what it means in theory. How could I put it over? Let me see if I could give you an analogy. If you have on a household level, right? You have 3 children, right? You have three children. All of a sudden, one of them did well in university. They get a fancy job. All the time they're earning $200,000. Now they start making $1 million. So he earning more, and he sharing the wealth to nobody. He ain't helping to uplift the rest of his siblings and the parents. They're still living in a dilapidated house. They're still struggling to eat, but he having a good life. That's the Dutch disease at the household level. So it's when you don't do anything. You're making all this money, right? You are making all this money. You're not doing anything to build up the other sectors, to build up your brother and your sister in the household. You're not doing anything there. You're still living in your house. You're not trying. You don't build a new house to improve the wealth of everybody, the well-being of everybody else. That's what the Dutch disease means. When this one sector alone getting richer, the people who operating in this sector getting richer, they earning more money, they're driving a fancy car, everything.
everybody else become poor. That's the Dutch disease.
And before that sibling was earning $1 million, the other siblings and the other members of the family would have been contributing to that household. And when he reached the stage where he's getting $1 million, he forgot.
And why did that happen? Because the people who run in the household now, the parents, them ain't do nothing. As the parents, them say, well, pay for send your sister to school, send her to university now, send your brother to university now, give you $1 million grant now. The parents, who is the government in this case, they have to guide that child who is blessed with this abundance of resource to uplift them. So the parents ain't do nothing, them not telling nothing, so them stay. So they're inflicted with the Dutch disease in essence. That is exactly what the Dutch disease is. So the parent who's the government need to intervene to enhance everybody else from this one mouth.
Is the massive agricultural drive one such intervention?
Absolutely. Can they see the agriculture sector right now accounts for 20%, about 20% of GDP, right? There are several subsectors: sugar, rice, cash crops, livestock, aquaculture. The regional market that we're going after, that the government is driving, right, to build the infrastructure, look at the regional transportation and logistic system, right, to achieve that target, to reduce the regional food import bill of $5 billion, that's a 1.25 billion US dollars market. If we're gonna achieve, and we're making tangible steps to achieve that. So if we achieve the 25% target by 2025, and we achieve another 25% by the next 5 years, 2030, that's 50%. 50% of $5 billion is how much? That's $2.5 billion. US dollars. That's half of our pre-oil GDP. So it's substantial, it's significant, right? So the answer is yes. What we're doing, right? Yes, it's going to have a major impact.
All right, great. So we delayed talking numbers. So I'm going to go over some numbers that I'm hearing quite often to refute your argument that the Dutch disease isn't present. So these are there. So in the half-year report, the government recorded a 55.9% decline in the production of sugar, an 11.8% decline in fish production, and a 26.4% reduction in shrimp production. Rice production in the first 6 months of the year also dropped by 22.4%, while there was a 1.5% contraction in the mining sector. There was also a contraction in the manufacturing sector, and I think you alluded to this earlier, by 11.4%. We are, like I said, these numbers are being used to substantiate the argument that the Dutch disease, or there are signs of the Dutch disease in Guyana. How do you respond to that?
I'm glad you asked that question. So economics, economic policy, the effects of it is something you have to look at over time. Looking at a half-year result doesn't tell you the full picture, doesn't show you the beauty. You don't get to see the full beauty. Now, if you read the report, importantly, it is not the decline that you have to worry about. What you have to worry about is the reason, because the reason will tell you there are many factors that could contribute to that decline. And it is the reason, the causation, the cause for that, the root cause for that decline is what you have to worry about, not the actual decline. And so if you read the reason for those decline, you will see they are inclement weather, they're operational. None of it has to do with policy. None of it has to do with economic policy. And therefore, that does not substantiate the argument. Because naturally, especially agriculture sector, you're going to have inclement weather and things out of your control, flood and so forth. So 1 year you can see decline, 1 year you can see increases and so on. Sugar. Let me talk about sugar for a bit.
Yes.
Right?
Very popular.
The sugar industry, yes, it has been in decline for many years. There were attempts to resuscitate the industry by both governments. The previous government, and this is what pains my heart because I came from a sugar community. My parents, my entire family, our ancestors came from sugar. We were still in sugar. I grew up in a sugar community. The previous government paid $50 million to do a commission of inquiry by someone whom I admired greatly, Dr. Clive Thomas, who headed that commission. Dr. Clive Thomas, in his report, never recommended the closure of any estate. He did very thorough work, and he presented a comprehensive menu of recommendations. And you know what he recommended? He recommended that no estate should be closed at this time. He recommended for further studies, socio-economic impact assessment study, and he proposed a menu of options, diversification options that could diversify the revenue stream of the sugar industry. And he recommended that we need to do feasibility of all these options and implement them. You know what the government did? The Minister of Agriculture then took to the Parliament, took that $50 million piece of document, your money and my money, paid to do it, put it in the garbage, right? Put it in the garbage, and did something called a white paper, 5 pages. Dr. Thomas' report was more than 100 pages long. 2 reports you had. You had the field report and you had the economic report, right? Over 300 pages of documents, 5 pages of white paper, cotton-based paper, and call it a white paper and take it to Parliament and say this is where we're going. We have to close all the estates. You know what that did to the economy? This thing about it's a drain on the trade. You got to understand how an economy works. $5 billion to pay wages to sustain 7,000 people. The multiplier effect of that is 5 times because they're going to spend in the community markets, in the supermarket, in the village economies, in the shops, the fisherman, the taxi guy, they go to town on the shop, they sustain the village economy. So then you have the indirect sector. You had the indirect impact of that. You had about 40,000 dependents. You had contractors. You had private cane farmers. Private cane farmers have other people working with them too. You had contractors with trucking service, transportation. All those people were affected, and the people who depended on them because they depended on an income to pay the mortgage in the bank to sustain their families, to provide for their families, to increase the standard of living. They're out all of a sudden of a job. Then that sector brings in foreign exchange input, so we take away all of that. So you took out essentially on a $5 billion argument, $40 billion in terms of the multiplier that it used that generates in the economy to keep the economy, the village economy going. That's sugar. Now, let me make one more point, right? The effect of their, I call it contractionary policy. Contractionary policy is when you raise taxes. When you raise taxes, businesses can't grow because the cost of business go up, your cost of investment goes up. It's not attractive to make new investments. You don't have new opportunities being created. You ain't building the infrastructure to support further growth. You ain't creating new industries. So you don't have new opportunities, and so there's nothing, and so there is a decline. And you know what a decline amounted on? This is facts and figures, and anybody, Elson Lowe could go and take the Bank of Guyana report. Let me explain the methodology. Take the Bank of Guyana report. Look at our GDP for these productive sectors, non-oil productive sectors from 2009, and look at the numbers from 2020. Put it in an Excel sheet, tabulate it cumulatively, and look at the difference between the two periods, the cumulative growth and this cumulative growth, and look at the difference. The non-oil sector for forestry, those same sectors, services sector, contracted by $130 billion in 5 years. From 2009 to 2014, the growth was stronger and more broad-based. 2015 to 2020, we have lost $130 billion of our productive output in those sectors. Export earnings, we have lost $107 billion. In US dollars, that's 1.14 billion US. In productive output and export earnings from the non-oil sector, we have lost in their 5-year period compared to a 5-year period where you had stronger growth. You can't dispute that. That is what we have lost, and that is how you have to look at it.
We can
That is how you have to
discuss
look at it.
sugar in its entirety because that can be done on another program where we focus specifically on sugar and have healthy debates on that. But what about the argument that we should be moving towards diversifying the sugar industry?
That is what is
Because
happening.
sugar
So that is what is happening. Sugar, they've killed the industry. So it's very challenging. It's very challenging, and so yes, of course.
They have killed
That's
the industry, or the industry was struggling all the time?
Well, the industry, yes, was struggling for various reasons, external reasons, political economy reasons, economic reasons. Yes, but then something struggling is like, I don't know how to put it. But you killed it, you compound the issue. You compound the issue. Right? So, yes, diversification, this is what the government is doing. Wales development zone, Wales estate can't come back. So they have to do something there. So what's happening with Wales? Wales being converted into an industrial park. The gas, the shore is gonna land there. So now they're gonna create industries there. Right? They have to find alternative uses for all the other estates that are not functioning.
All right, we're running out of time, and I really wish to Mr. Lowe is here because he's mentioned something on a recent program that he hosts, and he said, quote, "Whenever you hear the government has an idea, ask yourself, what does a coalition think? Because the coalition ideas are the better ideas." How do you respond to that?
Let me take one of his proposal, right? He said, look, he talks about this, okay, we earning because of the high oil prices.
High oil prices,
We're getting more money,
revenue.
more revenue, right? So he said, let me take this difference. Let me take this difference and subsidize and pay and give, I don't know, the taxi and whoever he's suggesting to give, right? Let me take that difference. But he didn't do the analysis, because if he did the analysis, he would have found out, he would have known that, one, the government already subsidized fuel by reducing that tax. Then they did a further subsidization, a further subsidy with the reduction in guy oil. Right? That's a further subsidy. Then he talks about recently subsidizing the vulnerable electricity. But
Yes,
guess
that
what?
you shouldn't pay electricity.
But guess what?
If your electricity
Did your
bill is at a
electricity bill increase? You pay more electricity bill?
No.
Your electricity bill, it went up? Exactly.
No.
My electricity bill, the rate didn't increase neither. His electricity bill increased neither. The entire country is what he is proposing for the government to subsidize the vulnerable. The fact that electricity rates raised, the government don't subsidize the whole country, because fuel is what is used to generate electricity. You know what is our fuel import bill? Before demanding went up substantially, right? Our fuel import bill is 500 million US and change before we had skyrocketing oil prices from 50 to over $100. You know what it increased to? To 823 million. That's over 60-something% increase, over $300 million increase. So this increase that he's talking about, because we don't have a refinery as yet, right? And we don't have gas to shore as yet. You can't take that increase because it offset the import. We got to pay more for import. So while we earn more on the profit oil from the crude that we sell, we got to pay more on the fuel we import in. So it offset each other from 500 to 300 million. So what are you talking about? Right? But the government has already done more than what he did, because electricity rate didn't raise, the GWI water bill didn't raise, but GWI got to pay more for fuel for their production. GPL got to pay more for the fuel for production. It went up by by 70 million, increase 70 million US when I look at the numbers and did some extrapolation. That's substantial. So the government has already absorbed that cost. So he proposing about vulnerable and this, you do no analysis.
Here's a hot button issue. Is the government doing enough for public servants?
So, public servants is a sensitive topic,
Okay.
a sensitive debate. But let's take it from financials, right? You run in a business. You run in a business. Public servants came out. Remember, the country was bankrupt. We had to rebuild the country. Where public servant wages, apart from wages and salary, there are a whole host of other benefits that public servants get at different levels, right? But let's not focus on that. Let's talk about public servants and their salary, because that's the big debate. Let's look at it from a prudential financial management standpoint. When you're running a business, you got to run a country. Financial management principle is the same whether you're running a country, whether you're running a company, or whether you're running a household, right? Your income, the cost if you have a business, your employment costs should not be more than 30% of your revenue. Because you can only afford to pay wages based on how much revenue you bring in. Correct? Wages and salaries come from the revenue that you bring in. Where is the revenue coming from to pay public servants? It comes from taxes paid by the private sector. The private sector before revenue taxes was about $200 billion, right? If you look at total employment costs for the public servants, for the public sector, it's 30% of the total revenue.
Okay,
Right?
I'm being told that we have to wrap up soon, so I have two more questions.
Give me a
but
minute,
go
let me
ahead.
finish it.
Explain,
It's
please.
30% of your total revenue. Now, your revenue, which comes from taxes, could only grow if you expand the economy. Once you allow businesses to go, create the environment for businesses to grow, to invest more, pay more taxes, so your organic tax revenue base could grow, and then you could gradually increase your wages relative to the revenue that you generate. That takes time. That takes time. So the government has already maxed out from a prudential standpoint. There are some companies who pay 15%. The universal standard is 15% to 30% of your revenue should be wages. So between 15 and 30% you could play with that. Because wages is one component, you got other costs, admin costs, electricity costs, you got to run the country, you got to pay debt and all these other bills. So 30% is the benchmark, maximum. Companies pay less than that. So if the government, when you look at employment costs as total revenue, and if it was 15% or 10%, well, then you have an argument to say, well, this government isn't paying public servants good. But practically, you could only pay the maximum that you can afford in terms of the revenue that the country generates in taxes. And because you have to sustain it, you can't have a sharp increase and then you can't sustain it. What happens? You're still going to go bankrupt. So it has to happen over time. And this is why all this development, bearing in mind we had 10 years setback. So if we didn't have 10 years setback and build all this infrastructure and we had our organic revenue base had grown, today public servants should have been enjoying a better salary and wages. So it will happen. It will happen. The current, when you look at the numbers, it's already at the maximum level, what the government could sustainably afford. You're looking at our public finances. As we use oil revenues, it is not recommended. You can't use oil revenues to pay wages. You got to use it to invest. That would create the framework that will generate more revenue sustainably. That will happen. All this will happen, but it will take time.
It's a sustainability issue. It will take time.
Correct.
Apart from the revaluation of the currency, which is something you said should be done, is there anything else government can do to prevent the Dutch disease?
Yes. They need to continue to do what they're doing. Manage the economy prudently, keep our debt levels low, invest in the infrastructure, build up our human capacity, invest in our human. We have to turn around that equation. I told that ratio I told you earlier, 95 to 5. You have to invest in that. So you have to make tangible investment in all to address all of our development challenges. Because remember the household example we're talking about Dutch disease. One person and you're uplifting the others. So you have to deal with all of our development challenges. We have an energy problem, we got to deal with that. Are we doing that? Yes, we're doing that. We have an infrastructure problem. We got to deal with that. Are we doing that? Yes, we're doing that. We have a human capital problem. We have to deal with that. Are
Yes.
we doing that? Yes, we're doing that.
So, in summary, in your professional opinion, Guyana is not suffering from the Dutch disease. We're not showing signs of the Dutch disease. It's a possibility, but government
It's a concern
it's a concern
that has to be managed.
that has to be managed. Let me quote you correctly. But government is doing all it can
All the right things. They're doing all the right things.
at this time to prevent that from happening. Is there anything else that you would want to say to our viewers before we end the program?
Well, thank you for having me here. I hope I explained simple enough for the viewers to understand. And again, I just want to register my deep, deep, deep disappointment and regrets that Lowe did not show up. I hope he comes to redeem himself on the next show.
Well, let me take this opportunity to invite you to be part of another
the answer
discussion
is yes.
because I
The
really
answer is
want
yes.
for us to have open, candid debates about what's happening in Guyana and issues affecting Guyanese. And I would like for the next time you sit here, sitting across from you will be a member of the opposition, so that we can have that exchange of
Certainly,
ideas.
I'd be happy. I would always make myself available despite all whatever I have going on because this is important for the country.
The contrary to what was said, this government has the right ideas. It's going in the right direction.
Well, I just dismantle it, so they gotta come and defend it.
All right. So thank you very much for joining us on this first episode of Perspectives. I'm Candicia Kendall Lewis. See you next week, Thursday. We hope to have author guests in studio. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the evening.